Nestled away in the southwest of the state of Illinois lies the small, unremarkable city of Murphysboro. What once was a tiny, quiet town now has grown into a tiny, quiet city. There's not really much that happens here. There are a few festivals that take place throughout the year. The city's famous Apple Festival, which highlights all things Apple related, happens every Labor Day in the fall, drawing in roughly around 45,000 people every year and still going strong. Then there's the Riverside Blues Festival, showcasing all sorts of musical talent and local vendors, as well as the Big Money Brew Fest, which comes along every October, drawing in over 100 different breweries and thousands of eager beer enthusiasts. At first glance, Murphysboro seems like any other humble city, filled with fun traditions and unique history. Although the festivals, while are known far and wide and draw in thousands of statewide visitors every year, the city itself is better known around the world as the location where a horrifying monster back in the 70s made frequent appearances, where it went on to terrorize the citizens. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins, and welcome back to Moonlight Lore. It was a quiet summer night in June of 1973. The crickets were singing their nightly songs and the fireflies danced along on top of the surface of the Big Muddy River, running along the south end of Riverside Park just on the edge of town. It's here we find two lovers sitting in a parked car, Randy Needham and Judy Johnson. The two had snuck away for this romantic rendezvous in a Romeo and Juliet-themed rebellion against their parents. Judy's father expressed his strong disapproval for the boy she had chosen to date, and had forbidden her from seeing him again after learning who exactly Randy was as a character. This is why the pair had snuck out of their homes this evening, and met up in such an isolated spot. Doing what couples would typically be found doing in such an environment, they took a pause and began talking, while Randy was adjusting the radio to set the mood. While Randy was flipping through the stations, making an effort to quickly find the right song for the pair to listen to, it was in between the static and pauses in their conversation did a noise drift through the calm, warm air from the bushes and into the open window of Randy's car. A bizarre screech pierced through the tranquil night, immediately sending shivers down Judy's back and standing the hair on Randy's neck. The two sat frozen in place, terrified to even move. Whatever it was something they had never heard before, and it came from the thick underbrush just a few short feet away from the parked car. Randy quickly clicked off the radio, killing the background music and plunging them back into pure silence as they both held their breath. Judy gripped her boyfriend's arm out of fear and whispered she wanted to leave. Randy, however, was more interested in finding out where that noise originated from, so he rolled down his driver's side window, stuck his head outside, and peered into the darkness. Within seconds, he noticed the bushes directly in front of the car began rustling. Then, a second roar pierced through the air. This was enough for Judy to let out a terrified yelp and forcefully pull Randy back inside the confines of the vehicle. Fumbling with his keys, Randy stabbed them into the ignition, allowing his car to burst to life. In doing so, the headlights flashed on, illuminating the tall, leafy shrubbery before them. But that wasn't all. Before them stood a towering, grotesque creature lumbering towards the two. Both of the frightened teenagers let out their own ear-piercing screams before Randy threw the car into reverse and drove out of there, sending dirt and rocks flying into the air as the tires searched for traction. Randy and Judy, both unwillingly, had the first known encounter with the mud monster of Murphysboro. It took the young couple just mere minutes before they sped back into the safety of the glowing streetlights of town. The two were stunned with what they had just witnessed and drove in silence for a while, worried about how to breach the awkward silence and ask the other what had just happened. Finally, Judy turned to Randy and asked with a shaking voice if what they had seen was real. Randy, of course, didn't know what to say that would offer any kind of comfort to his trembling girlfriend, but instead broached the idea that perhaps it might be best if they head to the local police station and report the incident to the authorities. His understanding of the situation was, if the monster they had just seen was in fact real, and their eyes hadn't been playing tricks on them, it was best to report it so at the very least law enforcement could track it down and prevent it from harming anyone else who might come across it as well. Judy, on the other hand, was firmly against this idea. Remember, she was out on the town with a boy her father had very clearly forbade her from seeing. She didn't want to have to face the wrath of her father if word got out. Though with a bit of pressure and convincing from Randy, she finally relented and agreed to go to the police station with him to file a report. Upon their arrival to the front steps of the station, the two froze mid-step, side by side, both thinking to themselves how exactly they would describe what they saw to the officers inside without sounding unhinged. Nevertheless, they knew this was something that needed to get done, and if they looked like fools in the eyes of the police, at least they could rest easy knowing they had done the right thing. Taking a final deep breath and linking hands, the couple hesitantly opened the double doors and stepped inside. Surprisingly, with maybe only a few raised eyebrows, the officers on duty that night listened intently to this young couple's story. If anything, it was a good distraction to break up the monotony of their night shift. But as the two went further and further into the details of their encounter, the officers slowly realized the frightened teenagers before them had likely seen something, though what that something was seemed a little far-fetched. Going over what the creature could have been, Officer Manwaring sat the couple down and began listing off wildlife native to the state of Illinois, but every animal he suggested it could have been only conflicted with what Randy and Judy told him. The young lovers told the officers it was unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was like a hulking, oversized gorilla walking on two massive legs that held up its 7-foot-tall frame. Its long, light-covered hair, matted and muddied with the debris it roamed through to get near them. The screech it emitted was nothing like they had ever heard before, and both agreed a human being could not have made that noise. They also added a pungent foul odor wafted through the air, becoming stronger as the beast walked closer to the car. Tapping his pen against his wooden desk, Officer Manwaring stared blankly at the two with a sense of disbelief and confusion. He wasn't sure if what he was being told was the truth, or if it was the simple antics of two kids trying to pull one over on the police. Eventually, he broke the silence. Going off his gut instinct, he came to the conclusion these two were in fact telling him the truth, or at the very least were telling him they witnessed something strange. He didn't fully believe they had a run-in with a monster seemingly straight out of a bad Hollywood horror film. But seeing the terrified state they were in added to their convincing story. Knowing the two risked public ridicule when word got out that they had been scared off by a supposed monster, and risked the wrath of Judy's father coming down on them, he decided at the very least they could investigate the area they said they spotted the beast in. Standing up from behind his desk, Manwaring called over two other officers, Officers Merrill Lindsay and Jimmy Nash, and asked them to head out with one of the squad cars to search for the large muddy beast. The two looked at each other confused, then back at Manwaring, and asked with their eyes if he was serious. Of course he was, then ordered them to get moving. Within just minutes, the two officers found themselves down near the Big Muddy River in Riverside Park. By their best estimate, they were in the same general area where the young couple had been parked. So, combing through the thick bushes and struggling with traversing the muddy ground, the resentful officers mumbled to one another why they were even there. Surely the idea of a giant muddy monster roaming the underbrush was just something the two kids fabricated to lure them out there to waste their time. As the pair were doubting the reason why they were there, Officer Nash, illuminating the soft ground with his flashlight, noticed something a little strange imprinted in the mud. What was described as an abundance of peculiar tracks dotted the ground all around them. They measured roughly around 10 to 12 inches long, but only 3 inches wide, and were pressed 3 to 4 inches deep into the mud. This was a peculiar find. Nash and Lindsay really hadn't believed Randy and Judy were telling them the truth, but here were the tracks. Whatever made them obviously didn't have normal-sized feet. They definitely weren't made by any human, but for them to be made by an animal seemed just as unlikely. But like it or not, these tracks meant something to the officers. It meant something was indeed roaming the area, and if what Randy and Judy had told them back at the station was true, they realized they may be in very real danger. Officer Nash quickly unholstered his service revolver and held it with a slightly trembling hand, now paranoid that he was being watched. Wanting to get a closer and better look at the footprints in the mud, just to make sure he couldn't identify who the owner could have been, whether it was animal or human-made, he bent down with his flashlight fixated on one of the strange tracks. But as he did so, a blood-curdling scream threw him off balance and into the mud. The sound emanated from the darkness several feet away from his position, and Nash struggled to see what it was that made that sound. In his fall, his flashlight and revolver fell out of his hands and disappeared into the dark ground. Now defenseless to whatever it was that was out there, he scrambled to right himself and grabbed his flickering flashlight off the ground. Both he and Lindsay bolted from the scene, fearing whatever it was that was surely right behind them. Night can be a funny thing. For some, it can mean peace and quiet from a long, busy day, a chance to finally relax. Others, however, find it can hide our deepest fears. It can allow our imaginations to run rampant. While shadows bounce and dance across the landscape surrounding us, when noises from unidentified sources bellow out, they can cause us to abandon all sensibility and replace our rationale with our darkest fears. When the two officers eventually returned back to the station, they burst through the front doors of the building with pale faces, unbelieving what they had just experienced. As expected, those at the small station were eager to hear what had happened, and why Nash had returned without his very important sidearm, and what could have caused him to abandon it in the park. After taking a few moments to collect themselves, the two shared their findings with the others, taking great care as to not leave out any details. Those who had remained at the station were captivated with their co-worker's tale. They were convinced the two kids who had came in earlier telling them the exact same things were lying. But Nash and Lindsay were here now, saying the exact same things. This news that a mysterious beast could be prowling just outside of town sent a stir through the small police station. Everyone questioned what the next course of action should be. To all their credit, Nash and Lindsay volunteered to return to the scene with the help of Officer Bob Scott and a now much calmer Randy Needham, who realized proving his bravery might just win him some favor with the officers, Judy, and Judy's father. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on the 26th of June, roughly just 2 hours since the first sighting by Randy and Judy, the three officers and Needham returned to the scene where they quickly began finding even more strange footprints in the mud. These ones were just as bizarre as the ones seen before, with each print seemingly pressed in at different depths. Spacing between the steps varied, where some were 5 or 6 feet apart from the last, others were just 1 or 2, and some prints even seemed to be different sizes than the last. Upon finding them, the small posse stood around a particularly large patch of imprints, while Officer Lindsay decided to run back to the squad car in order to retrieve a camera. The three left standing there, surrounded by footprints, began to wonder, if some of these prints varied in size, spacing, and depth, could that possibly mean there was more than one of these creatures wandering about? As they pondered this petrifying revelation, they were interrupted with the sounds of something large moving through the water just meters away. It was described as if it was like a large person walking knee-deep through the cloudy water. While they paused their quiet conversation to listen, the sound of moving water suddenly stopped, replaced with an eerie silence that filled the air. It was at this moment one of the men noticed the crickets had also stopped chirping and the bullfrogs ceased croaking. The three stood in a never-ending standoff with whatever it was that was in the water, their flashlights unable to pierce through the darkness and reach the water's edge. Suddenly, similar as before, another dreadful screech broke through the night air and threw the three men into a panicked frenzy. Seeing how the three were hindered by the muddy ground, they slipped and scrambled to put as much distance as they could between them and the water's edge. Lindsay, who was on her way back from the car, heard the cries and shouts of the others quickly approaching. Before she had time to react, she was met with Scott quickly grabbing onto her arm and pulling her back towards the direction of the car. The four sat still, occasionally only moving to wipe the condensation from the window so they could see if whatever was out there was coming for them. But as they waited and nothing came, their nerves slowly returned to them. For what seemed like an eternity, the four finally worked up the courage to return to the wild night and continue their investigation. Luckily, they didn't encounter any hulking beasts hiding in the shadows or hear any more bumps in the night, and were able to continue their investigation well into the early morning hours. It was during this time they documented and took pictures of the strange footprints in the mud, as well as hunted for any more evidence of a strange creature being in the vicinity, although it was quite dark, and they were unable to find any other proof aside from the prints. The officers prayed this was the last they would ever hear from the dreaded monster wading through the waters of the Big Muddy River. Just like Randy and Judy felt, they did not want this thing to wreak any havoc on the community and possibly harm someone. But with little to no evidence to go off of, they were forced to hold their breath and wait. The police didn't have to wait long. Though some might chalk this encounter up to the active and creative imagination of a young child, just 24 hours after Randy Needham's and Judy Johnson's encounter in Riverside Park, 5-year-old Christian Barrow was playing in his backyard late on the night of June 26th. His mother had granted him a small jar in order to catch fireflies with that evening. While he was going about his innocent task, he noticed something large and pale creeping along the back fence. Immediately, Christian dropped his glass jar and ran inside the safety of his home to tell his father there was a giant ghost wandering just outside the fence. Of course, Christian's father passed it off to the nonsensical ramblings of a child's imagination and simply told his son to start getting ready for bed. At the same exact time, the neighbor's teenage daughter, Cheryl Ray, was out on the patio with her boyfriend, Randy Creeth. The two were enjoying the peaceful night when the pair noticed something moving around in the small patch of trees just behind 37 Westwood Lane. They thought perhaps it was one of the neighborhood kids just playing around, but as they sat there and watched, they witnessed the hulking pale figure of a 7 to 8 foot tall giant emerge from the bushes. They watched in anticipation as the creature crept closer to the fence line, then suddenly turned around and began walking back towards the trees it had just came from. As the creature slowly lingered around the area, making its way back towards the tree line, Randy Creeth wanted a closer look at the mysterious colossal and began walking towards it. He claims he got within 30 to 40 feet from it, and from his best estimates, looked roughly close to 300 to 300 pounds. Whatever this thing was, it definitely wasn't human, by evidence of its sheer size, long shaggy white hair, and overwhelming musky stench. What Cheryl and Randy were wide-eyed studying that night was an unknown creature never before seen until that week. Incidentally, this location being only a 20-minute straight walk from Riverside Park and the Big Muddy River running outside of town. Cheryl's mother, after the two teenagers came rushing back into the house and informing her what they had just seen, quickly called the police, asking them to come and look around the area just to be safe. Officers Jimmy Nash and Ron Manwaring, upon hearing a strange white-haired creature was on the prowl in a residential neighborhood, quickly arrived on site, not wasting any time to get there after knowing what had been seen and heard just 24 hours earlier. Still wanting to avoid frightening the local population and keeping this situation under the radar as much as they could, the responding officers did their best to comfort the complainants and ensure them that they had everything under control. Wrapping up their conversation with Mrs. Ray as quickly as they could, without seeming too anxious about the incoming investigation, Officers Nash and Manwaring departed the residence and began searching for their suspect. Behind the houses and drawing closer to the trees where it had vanished, the two officers came across a large area of weeds that had been pressed down by something heavy walking through, forming the clear signs of a path. Knowing this was the trail of the creature they'd been hunting for the past day, they called in Security Officer Jerry Nellis and his German Shepherd, who was known far and wide as being a talented and excellent search and rescue as well as attack dog. If the rumors were correct, and that this beast had such a powerful, overwhelming odor that even humans could pick up on, surely an experienced canine trained in the art of tracking would have no problems with the task. When Officer Nellis turned up with his dog, just as expected, it only took seconds before it was able to pick up on the scent. Before they knew it, the three officers, led by their trusty four-legged companion, were deep in the weeds and trees. With only the light of their flashlights to see by, the three officers were forced into an uncomfortable position of running headfirst into the unknown blackness of the night, fully putting their trust in the dog leading them deeper and deeper. Throughout their hunt, the three would occasionally find themselves stopping to catch their breath, while the dog surveyed the area to determine the direction to go. But it was during these little pauses the dog, along with the officers, began finding strange slimy residue left behind on the weeds and grass. Increasingly interested in the substance, the dog would sniff it, then know exactly where to go next, before stopping to sniff some more. Obviously, this slime was left behind by the creature. While inspecting one of these patches of slime-riddled grass, Officer Nellis rubbed some of it on his fingers to try and determine what it was, but as he did so, it left behind a black coloring on his fingers. Regardless of this find, this wasn't exactly what the small group was looking for, so they pressed on. However, it didn't take long before the dog tried leading the three men down a steep embankment that led into an area of thick bushes, weeds, and trees. The officers shining their flashlights across the area determined it to be far too difficult for them to traverse through it all, so they decided to go around and search the area rather than follow the exact trail this thing was moving by. This was when Officer Nellis and his dog separated from the other two and came across an old rundown barn that had obviously been abandoned for years. The dog tugged at its leash and barked wildly at the old building, clearly indicating that what they were following was hiding inside. Though try as he might, Nellis couldn't convince his attack dog to enter the barn. Knowing the other two officers weren't far away, he cried out for them to meet him at the barn, and within just minutes, Nash and Manwaring emerged from the darkness ready to regroup. Despite ordering his dog again and pulling his leash towards the barn, it refused to go anywhere near the door. According to Nellis, this dog had never acted this way before. He was very experienced and trained to do this very specific task, though at this moment, it had some serious reservations about entering that shadowy barn. It doesn't say in the police report if they did end up investigating the inside of the barn or not, though if they had, there likely would have been some notes written in the report about their findings in there. The fact there are none leads me to believe they neglected to search it, leaving whatever might have been hiding in there to continue its reign of terror for another day. And that's exactly what happened. While news of the monster sighting around Murphysboro spread throughout the county, the police at the small detachment were overwhelmed with complaints, concerns, and tips relating to the creature. Although no one would spot the creature for quite some time, the police were clear that until this thing was caught or killed, everyone in town had to take precautions. That meant no going out late at night or wandering outside of town alone. Simple and reasonable rules. But of course, these types of rules would hinder any further sightings of the beast, making it rather difficult for the officers in town to locate or track it down. At the time, Police Chief Toby Berger and every officer under his command were under incredible stress and pressure to catch this thing terrorizing their town. In regards to the rumors currently circulating about the Murphysboro monster, I'm sure that advice is one thing of which you have more than enough of. However, the developing situation prompts me to offer some more nonetheless. As somewhat of a student of situations like these, I feel that if the level of fright among the general populace increases, then the probabilities of violence also increases. With an identified and concrete source of evil and danger, the resort to guns as a means of defense becomes very probable, unwitting and unnecessary homicide being a likelihood. Therefore, my counsel would include 3 recommendations. 1. Public statements from your office asking citizens not to use whatever guns they might have, except under clear and perfectly understood circumstances. 2. Public statements from your office trying to diffuse the danger of this creature. This would take the form: do not assume that this creature, if it exists, is antagonistic, aggressive, or belligerent. 3. Encounters with this creature should not encourage violence or provocation. I'm sure your office desires a quick and decisive end to this situation. I hope I might have been some help. Thank you. Respectfully yours, Alan Clardy, Mayor of Murphysboro. It was clear the police and city officials had their hands full with something unknown. Nobody knew what exactly it was, but when faced with the unknown, you should always prepare for the worst. It so happens when word began to spread about the monster, so did rumors of several vigilante groups wanting to take matters into their own hands and hunt the beast. Of course, officials knew this would only cause more harm than good. If there was a creature out there, provoking it into defending itself from the onslaught of trigger-happy citizens would only lead to an eventual attack. Or, if there just so happened to not really be a live monster roaming the rivers and woods outside of town, you got multiple parties of people firing off guns at anything that moves, likely leading to an accidental shooting. So you could say, time was of the essence for Chief Berger and his officers. Though as the days turned into a week, and no news reports or sightings came in, they thought perhaps whatever had been plaguing their town had possibly moved on. That is until July 7th, when a traveling carnival visited town. While they didn't experience any strangeness for the first week they were already there for in Riverside Park, it wasn't until the 7th of July did 4 workers who were more or less unaware of the events happening around town before arriving got the feeling they were being watched by someone. But it was 2 in the morning, and the carnival had been long closed. There shouldn't have been anyone else in the park at that time. Unable to shake the eerie feeling, the workers decided it best to just continue on with their work and close out for the day as fast as possible. While they hurried along, tending to each small detail to ensure a smooth opening in the morning, they became distracted by a very distinct sound. The ponies they had tied up, and would use to give small children rides on, were starting to cause quite the commotion, and were very obviously in distress. As it would so happen, the ponies were tied up near the tree line, so the workers thought that perhaps there was a coyote stalking nearby. When the 4 of them walked closer, they were all stunned to see they were gravely mistaken. As the 4 froze in place, the being their eyes were drawn to were not of that of the panicked ponies, but of the hulking giant standing right beside them. By their best estimate, the light-haired gorilla-looking creature was standing on 2 muscular legs at around 8 feet tall. It looked as if it was around 300 to 400 pounds. Though they noted while its presence was frightening to them and the ponies, the creature didn't seem bothered by the 4 men. In fact, in the report they later made, they stated it was as if the creature was more so just curious about the small horses rather than having some sort of malicious motive. The 4, breaking their hypnotic gaze on the creature, retreated back and around the corner of one of their trailers to grab the attention of their boss, Bert Miller. When they managed to convince their stubborn and tired boss to come witness the scene, the 5 sprinted back into view of the ponies, but whatever creature was standing there just seconds before was now gone. While the workers stood in disbelief, looking back and forth at one another, questioning with their eyes if what they had seen was what the others had seen, Bert reprimanded the 4 for wasting his time and making up stories, then told them to get back to work. It was late, he was tired, and wanted to retire for the night. Though that wasn't the end of the carnival workers' night, they still had quite a bit of cleaning and setting up to do for the next day. But an hour later at 3 in the morning, one of the workers, Charles Kimball, stated that the creature made a sudden and quick reappearance near the ponies. Though he was the only one who managed to see it the second time, he managed to convince Bert to call the authorities to come check things out. I can only imagine the look of defeat the police officers must have had when they went a week and a half without hearing any news of this creature, and then only to get a call from Bert Miller one evening to learn it was still around or had returned. That night, Officer Nash and Officer Glotto responded to the call and did a thorough search of the area, unable to find any trace, tracks, or clues as to where the creature might have gone or where it came from. You might be thinking, well, the carnival came to town after hearing news of this mysterious beast wandering around, and hoped if the creature was spotted nearby, it would draw in more patrons to the park. While it is possible they might have heard news of the creature, it was said that Bert Miller, the owner of the carnival, actually didn't want the news of the sighting to get out. He was afraid it would actually scare away potential customers. Of course, though, you can't keep things hidden for very long in a small town. People talk, rumors spread, and crazy ideas are born. With the eventual news getting out that the creature was back and had been spotted at Riverside Park once more, it led many people to investigate, though they would never find anything. It was as if whatever this thing was had decided to move on, because after that night in July of 1973, it wasn't seen again that year. As it would turn out, 2 more sightings of the creature would eventually turn up, much at the displeasure of the law enforcement. However, it had been quite some time since the creature had been seen since the early hours of July 7th. In fact, it was exactly 3 years later. For that entire time, the citizens of Murphysboro were finally able to recover and rest easy at night, without having to worry about hearing strange noises in the dark. But as they learned, all good things must eventually come to an end. Mrs. Kells was the first to learn that lesson on the night of June 19th, 1976. Just before 10 p.m., Mrs. Kells made a call to the Murphysboro Police Department to inform them that her son and 2 friends had come running back to the house in an excited state, claiming they had seen a large creature standing behind 25 Westwood Lane and near the woods. Remember, 3 years prior at 37 Westwood Lane, just a couple houses down the road, was the place where a young Christian Barrow was outside catching fireflies just before he witnessed what he described was a large white ghost walking around on the other side of the fence, and then this being corroborated by teenagers Cheryl Ray and Randy Creeth when they claimed to have witnessed the hairy creature wandering around the area as well. This was likely not just a coincidence. That this monster suddenly made a reappearance exactly 3 years later in the same exact area. Officers Nash and Schultz were the ones who had the opportunity to investigate this new sighting. Nash more than likely was feeling a strong sensation of deja vu and was dreading the idea of having to pursue this beast through the dark woods once more. And when they pulled up to the front door of Kell's home, he found he and Schultz had quite the job ahead of them. There in the front yard stood Mrs. Kells, along with her son, his 2 friends, and another set of parents. While they were escorted to the area the creature had been spotted in, the 2 officers began to get a better picture of what had happened, as the excited boys were eager to share their news. According to them, they had been playing a small game of wiffle ball when one of them had hit a foul ball between the 2 houses. When they rushed behind the houses to retrieve said ball, that's when they saw it. A gorilla-like creature standing on 2 feet at 7 or 8 feet tall and wearing a gray coat of hair all over its body. They also happened to mention the large ears the creature had. These boys, of course, had heard small snippets of the stories of the creature of similar appearance terrorizing the town 3 years prior. Though as much as the parents attempted to keep its appearance as quiet as possible back then, word of the monster eventually reached the ears of the young kids, and they knew full well what they had just seen. While the officers searched the tree line and listened to the excited ramblings of the boys, while they also took down their statements, they found really nothing that would tell them that the monster had returned. No matter how hard they searched, they couldn't find any footprints in the dirt or leftover hair. Nothing. The only thing they did manage to find was a group of very large rocks having been overturned about 100 yards into the woods. Whoever had done this was there in the area very recently, as well as needing incredible strength to accomplish this feat. Next, we wait until just over a week later on June 27th, in 1976, when Merle Mifflin phoned the station to report a large creature had been spotted near his home. Again, Officer Nash responded along with Officer Ivaldi, who wanted to tag along to see if the sighting was legit or not. When they arrived at the Mifflin residence, they were informed by Merle that his 2 children, along with their friend, had spotted what they called was a large animal walking through the small wooded area where they were playing. The family dog, who was with the children at the time and was incredibly loyal to them, began barking non-stop and bolted from the woods without them, refusing to enter again. One of the children claimed the creature to have a large black coat, as well as standing around 6 feet tall, and from Ivaldi's estimation, likely weighing in around 5 or 6 tons. The other 2 described it as big, tall, and fat, and was walking south. The officers, along with Merle Mifflin, headed out into the wooded area the children claimed to have seen the large animal, but again, they were unable to find any discernible footprints in the ground that would indicate what the creature was and where it was heading. Whether or not these sightings made by these children in 1976 were real, or if they had heard the stories and their imaginations had gotten the better of them, we may never truly know. But news that this creature had returned struck the town with a new wave of concern and fear. Luckily, they didn't have to worry for long, as any further sightings of the creature oddly stopped entirely, finally leaving Murphysboro in peace, once and for all. Although the citizens of Murphysboro were happy this rash of encounters and sightings had ceased, there were other non-residents who were hoping to learn a thing or two about it. During his time in office in '73, Chief Toby Berger received his fair share of mail from individuals and groups interested in his plight. From the Administrative Office of Isotech Research Institute of Jamestown, New York. Dear Chief Berger, I was recently given a newspaper article containing a story about some kind of strange creature that apparently is giving you some problems. Since Isotech is engaged in the study of scientific phenomenon of all kinds, I found this report most interesting. If possible, I would appreciate any additional information or copies of actual reports that you have on this creature for use of further evaluation of this matter. Your cooperation will be greatly appreciated. Respectfully yours, Isotech Research Institute Director Dan R. Ostrander. From the University of Chicago, Department of Biology. Dear Mr. Berger, I have recently heard of your creature, which could be of considerable scientific interest. There have been many reports of such animals, but no real specimens have ever been available for scientific study. The reports are often thought to be due to bears, men living wild in the woods, hoaxes, and the like. Therefore, the very existence of such a creature is questionable, and its relationship to other animals would be of some interest if it is real. If the creature is shot, it is important that it not be buried, discarded, or given to sensation seekers. It should be embalmed or otherwise preserved in good condition. It would be preferable for the undertaker to ship it to me, or some other reputable scientist, because its study will need laboratory equipment and other materials. But if this cannot be done, I will come myself and arrange matters. I guarantee payment in such expenses involved in making a real specimen available for scientific study. Sincerely yours, Leah Van Valen, Associate Professor. It's clear at this point what many people believe the dreaded monster of Murphysboro to be. From the multiple letters from respectable scientific institutes, as well as individual fan mail from curious thrill seekers, everyone was under the impression that the beast terrorizing this small town was none other than the famous cryptid known as Sasquatch. The reasoning behind this theory is the large size of the creature consistently reported by all the witnesses. Then, of course, there's the full body of hair, making the monster have the appearance of a large gorilla who walks on 2 feet. What's interested many people, however, is the main difference that is present here. While most Sasquatch are said to have darker hair, brown or black, this one, according to every single witness, had lighter colored hair. Could it be, like humans and animals, that some of these creatures, as small in numbers as they might be, can still inherit the condition known as albinism, effectively giving this creature lighter hair than its Rocky Mountain relatives? I also want to bring up the smell. In numerous sightings, those who came within a certain distance of this creature claim to have smelt a horrific odor that accompanied the beast wherever it went. This is by far not a unique trait exclusive to this specific creature. There are those who have reported Sasquatch sightings and close encounters in the Rocky Mountains and had described the foul stench that follows these creatures everywhere they go. We can also consider the fact that a Sasquatch-like creature down in Florida was named specifically after the awful smell it would give off, the skunk ape. Whatever this large thing was, it obviously hung around the big muddy river that flowed just outside of town. Now this river, it has its name for a reason. It's not exactly the clearest water you'll find, to put it lightly. If a large humanoid monster was looking for a good place to hide, the wooded area that runs along this river would provide plenty of places to disappear into, the water itself being an excellent place to hide in. This is also how the creature had obtained its name, the mud monster of Murphysboro. Though there's no evidence to show it came from the murky waters of the river specifically, it's certainly likely it followed the river as its path, stopping in Murphysboro for a short visit before moving on, hidden and wading through the brown water or shuffling through the thick woods that bordered it. But let's think logically for a second now, ignoring legends and cryptids. What could this have been, if not for a literal monster from folklore and legend? While Illinois does not have an active bear population, which would be the first go-to animal one would think of when hearing this story, the neighboring states, Missouri and Wisconsin, do. although those populations are mainly made up of black bears and would unlikely be mistaken for an 8-foot-tall bipedal light-haired creature. So bears are likely not going to be the answer we're looking for. Other larger animals found in the Illinois wilds don't really give us anything either, the next best one being a bobcat, but even then it's hard to confuse a bobcat for what had been reported being seen. The state does get the occasional visit by cougars every now and then though, and they do happen to have lighter colored fur, though less white and more light brown and tan colored. If you have listened to my episode on the vampiric beast of Bladenboro, you would know that I had also suggested perhaps a cougar was to blame for those attacks. It would certainly explain the blood-curdling screams people in Murphysboro heard as well. I'll play a clip of what that sounds like for those who haven't listened to the Bladenboro episode. Now I'm going to make some small leaps here. If we think back to the first encounter when Randy and Judy were in the car, when they first encountered the monster, then reported it to the police, Randy described the scream he heard was similar to that of an eagle screeching into a microphone. If we consider Randy being a teenager, a 19-year-old, we could possibly assume he wasn't the most qualified person to distinguish the sound of certain animals. There's a chance he may never have even left the state before, or was an avid outdoorsman. If we take some liberties with those ideas, as well as the fact cougars don't necessarily populate the Illinois wilds all too often, he may never have been exposed to the horrifying screams cougars can make. Perhaps hearing the scream of a cougar coming from the darkness caused him and Judy to believe it was some sort of monster. And when the car headlights illuminated a large animal, like a cougar perhaps, Randy or Judy instantly believed it to be a large monster, because that's where their thoughts went to after hearing the bizarre and terrifying scream. We know from the police reports that both were terribly frightened and nearly hysterical when they had arrived at the police station to report the incident. That fact is what helped convince the police to investigate in the first place. So perhaps really, the two experienced something completely explainable, but through their panic and fear, imagined or embellished a few details that may or may not have been entirely accurate. Now let's consider the size of the city. At the time in the 1970s, the city's population was roughly around 10,000 citizens, according to the city's demographics on Wikipedia. This is not a largely populated place. If we take more liberties, we could maybe believe Randy Needham and Judy Johnson may have known Randy Cleeth and Cheryl Ray, both just 2 years younger at the age of 17. They apparently saw the creature the following night, walking around 37 Westwood Lane. Would it be so far of a stretch to assume, if the two couples were friends or at least ran in the same social circles, that they could have heard the story from Needham or Johnson sometime during the daylight hours of the 26th? If this could be the case, perhaps this couple also spotted an animal and embellished their story to fit the narrative of what the others saw the previous night. Or perhaps they didn't even see anything and just made it up to gain attention. However, I will say this. Christian Barrell, the 5-year-old who claimed to have seen something strange too that same night, more than likely has no real connection to the other two couples, and likely had no idea of the previous night's events. To me, Christian's sighting is the glue that holds this story together, though the imaginative mind of a 5-year-old is not very strong glue, I will admit. Scientifically speaking, there is a possibility what those people were seeing in 1973 in the dead of night may have been just an animal of some kind. When fear takes over and shadows dance across our surroundings, we start to see things that may or may not be correct. It could be possible that what people back then were seeing was just a cougar or bear, but to me, as skeptical as I am about most things, it seems unlikely all those people would have confused those animals for a giant bipedal monster. So, instead of it being an animal, maybe it was nothing. When I say this, I mean maybe it was all just a hoax, a small town wanting to bring tourists to it. We saw this happen as well in the Beast of Bladenboro episode. It was theorized the mayor and sheriff there had strummed up news and publicized the fact that they had an unknown mysterious monster stalking around the border of town. The news of this monster drew in hundreds of visitors to their town, and when they found public safety was beginning to be an issue, surprise, the beast was all of a sudden caught, and it turned out to be just an oversized bobcat. Circumstances in Murphysboro were similar. After news got out that they had their own monster living outside of town, people began visiting trying to spot it. Then all of a sudden, when public safety became an issue with people going out with their guns to do their own hunts for the beast, very few sightings of the monster were ever brought up again, aside from several children 3 years later. This story mirrors very similar to the Beast of Bladenboro story. But of course, this is all just a theory made up from my own skeptical mind. But I also want to add something very important about every single one of the stories I've shared here. In each encounter with the beast, there was no harm done by it. Nobody got hurt and no property was damaged. If this thing was real, by nature, it was a very precautious, gentle, and curious creature who just wanted to see the world around it, and ponies. If it wasn't real, those three characteristics are awfully convenient for anyone making up a story about a monster. While I'm hesitant to say this, I do believe people saw something strange wandering the woods, but if it was an actual animal or the infamous mud monster of Murphysboro, I can't exactly say. I don't believe it was a hoax, nor do I necessarily believe or am convinced that it was just a story to strum up tourism for the town. There's really no evidence for any of that, and there is evidence of strange footprints being found, along with multiple police reports being filed. The police, mayor, and citizens all knew there was something unexplained and unknown going on. If it was all faked, and it was just a conspiracy to draw in tourism, so many people would have had to have been in on it and stay silent for this entire time. The police would have had to have wasted tons of man-hours doing fake investigations and filling out fake paperwork from random people in the community who also would have had to have been in on it. So this is the reasoning why I believe there was something strange and mysterious going on in Murphysboro back in the 70s. Looking back at it today, we can see the appearance of the mud monster, intentionally or not, greatly impacted the community when it comes to visitors. It certainly didn't harm it in any way. The small city of Murphysboro, no matter how strange it might be, holds their history in high regards. If one were to visit the city, one could find souvenirs of the monster, murals of it painted in public spaces, and even food and beverages named after it. If anything, the monster has had a positive impact on the community. Whether that was intended or not, it certainly has created a unique and special atmosphere for the city. With no news or sightings of the creature resurfacing for the past 50 years, I believe it's safe to say Murphysboro's monster troubles are more than likely over for good. Thank you for listening to this episode of Moonlight Lore. I hope you enjoyed hearing the story of the mud monster of Murphysboro. What do you believe though? Do you believe the creature was real, then mysteriously as it came, it vanished? Or do you think it was all fake? Feel free to comment on any postings I make on Instagram or email or message me to tell me what you think. If you did end up enjoying this episode, subscribe to the show on whatever app you're listening on to get updates when new episodes drop. For even more content, visit moonlightlore.com to find information about the show, me, the host, old and new episodes, pictures, ways to contact me, and how to support the show. If you have a story of your own, a paranormal encounter, or run-in with a supernatural being like the mud monster, I'd love to hear about it. Feel free to message me over Instagram or by email at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com. Even if it's just to say hi, I love hearing from you guys. If you're looking for ways to support this show, the absolute best way is by becoming a Patreon supporter. For as little as $5 a month, you will gain access to monthly bonus episodes I put out on there. Your financial support helps me with costs of running the show and goes towards running the website, hosting fees, editing software, and everything else that comes with running it. I would be incredibly grateful for your support, and I hope to see some of you there. But I know money can be tight for some people, so if you can't support financially at this time, I understand. But the next best way to help the show is by sharing it on Facebook or Twitter with your friends and family, or even just telling them about it in person. It goes a long way in helping the show grow and become more popular on the podcast charts. Speaking of which, if you happen to have a few spare seconds, please consider leaving a 5-star review on Spotify and iTunes. It only takes a second and goes a long way to helping the show. I hope to have the newest Patreon bonus episode available at the end of the month, so be sure to stay tuned for news about that. I will also be sharing the post of the Mud Monsters tracks on Instagram, so be sure to give a follow on there to see those. But until then, I hope you're all doing well during these crazy times, and be sure to take care of yourselves. I'll be seeing you next time, and I hope you have a good day.